Good deal. Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Evan Reinsmith. I'm the Executive Director of the PRiME Center at St. Louis University. I'd like to welcome you all to our summer research webinar. We're highlighting the findings of three fantastic research projects that the center supported this past summer with some of our new friends helping out on improving policy and practice here in the state. Before we begin in earnest, I'd like to share a few logistical details. First off, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing it on our website. Should be available within the next few weeks. If you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat feature or raise your hand to voice your question at the end of the session. Please feel free to type questions in the chat as we go, but know that we won't be addressing these until the end of each individual presentation. With that said, I'd like to introduce our first presentation and speakers for today's webinar. This will be from Anita Mannion, who is an assistant professor of political science and affiliate faculty member in gender studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Her research focuses on the impact of policy on issues of equity, particularly in areas of education and elections. Anita will be joined by Sapna Varkey, who is an assistant professor of nonprofit and public management at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Her research identity focuses on performance and the organizational structures and practices and institutional pressures that can influence outcomes. Their session is titled Evaluating the Impact of 4-Day School Weeks in Missouri on Teacher Recruitment. And without further ado, please help me welcoming Drs. Mannion and Varkey.
Hello, we're so glad to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as Evan said, today Sapna and I are going to talk to you a little bit about a research project that we've been working on, trying to determine what is the impact of 4-day school weeks on teacher recruitment in Missouri public school districts. And so to give you a little background, in 2009, Missouri enacted legislation that allowed public school districts to implement a 4-day school week. So there are some requirements on pupil attendance hours, and it has to be approved by their local school board, but there's a lot of autonomy in the school districts in choosing to go to this schedule. As you can see in this graph here on the right, in the early years, there were very few schools that made this change to the 4-day school week, but in recent years, we've really seen that skyrocketing. And our study goes to the 2019-2020 school year, so that's what you see on this graph. But as of the 2020-21 year, last academic year, there were over 100 districts in Missouri with 4-day school weeks. And that doesn't include all the districts who made temporary adjustments to their schedules because of the pandemic. So the reason these districts say that they're making this change to a 4-day school week is to get cost savings through things like transportation, utilities, operational costs, and to improve teacher recruitment and retention. And so we really wanted to find out, in recent years, there's been a more focus on that recruitment and retention piece, as the cost savings have been kind of found out to be minimal. And so we wanted to find out if changing 4-day weeks has helped those schools recruit qualified teachers. So a quick preview of what we found is that although statewide districts with 4-day school weeks that did not significantly affect their ability to recruit teachers, in rural districts, 4-day school weeks positively affected the district's ability to fill vacancies, and statewide increased salaries also had a positive impact on teacher recruitment. Sapna will talk more about those findings, but before we get to that, we want to provide you with a little bit of context. So here on the left, you can see a map of all the school districts in Missouri. So the gray districts have 5-day weeks, and the districts with 4-day school weeks are color-coded by their year of adoption. So the darker districts are the ones that were some of the first adopters in Missouri, and then the lighter districts are the ones that have most recently moved to the 4-day school week. And you'll notice that over 95% of districts with 4-day school weeks are in rural areas. And there's also this clustering effect that once one district adopts the 4-day school week, other districts near it are more likely to adopt that. This isn't just a phenomenon that's happening in Missouri. Nationally, there's been an increase in the number of districts with 4-day school weeks of over 600% since 1999. So I went ahead and shared with you on the right this map that was published by the National Conference of State Legislators. And this was based on 2018 data, but just to give you an idea of what 4-day school week adoption looks like nationally. So if you see on this map, the schools that are in that green color, like Colorado, those states have more than 20% of their districts using a 4-day school week. The states that are teal, like Missouri in 2018, have somewhere between 2 and 20% of their school districts using a 4-day school week, and the Navy states have less than 2%. You can see this is a phenomenon that seems to be happening largely west of the Mississippi, although a few states over there in the more eastern part are dabbling in it with less than 2% of their districts adopting. The best current research indicates that more than 1,600 schools in 24 states have a 4-day school week. So it's really important that we better understand how these policies are affecting all of these teachers, students, and families. To provide a little bit more context on some of the reasons that 4-day school weeks have become so popular is teacher shortages. In Missouri in the 2019-2020 academic year, there was a 5% shortage in full-time instructors. And they also found that in that year, when they looked back at teacher retention, a 3-year and 5-year retention rate, that after 3 years, teacher retention was 64%, and after 5 years, it was only 48%. So that means there are a lot of vacancies to fill with qualified teachers and a lot of competition to get those qualified teachers. And of course, there are concerns that with the pandemic, more people will be leaving the profession and potentially making recruiting and hiring qualified teachers even more important and even more difficult. And in this competition, rural school districts are at a disadvantage. Studies have found that rural school districts have a hard time recruiting because lower teacher salaries and geographic isolation. And when they were surveyed, educational administrators in Missouri identified pay as the biggest challenge to recruitment. And as Sapna will show you, rural school districts in Missouri cannot compete on teacher salary. So they're turning to non-financial incentives, such as the 4-day school week, to try to recruit and retain teachers. And then a little bit about satisfaction with the 4-day school week. Other researchers have conducted surveys and found that in Missouri schools with the 4-day school week, 91% of teachers in those schools prefer the 4-day school week, and 69% of parents support the continuation of that schedule. So while there seems to be satisfaction with the schedule change, we still don't know if changing the 4-day school week is helping districts meet those goals of recruiting teachers. And that's really what we're trying to understand with this study. So now Sapna will tell you more about how we structured the study and what we found.
Thanks, Anita. So as Anita mentioned, our goal with this research was really to know whether that adoption of the 4-day school week had an effect on recruitment. And we measured recruitment in 3 different ways. So first was successful recruitment, and that's whether the vacancy was filled by a qualified applicant. We also measured unsuccessful recruitment in 2 different ways. So the first way we measured unsuccessful recruitment is whether they had courses that were altered due to the inability to fill the vacancy with a qualified candidate. The second way we measured unsuccessful recruitment was filling vacancies with less than fully qualified candidates. And so we used data from DESE from the 2009-2010 academic year to the 2019-2020 academic year, and really looked at those 3 outcomes. And so if you'll follow along with me on this figure here, just to illustrate what we did with our analysis is focusing on that red line first. Because districts that implemented the 4-day school week policy we incorporated all of the districts that adopted that 4-day school week policy in different years. And we analyzed data to look at the difference in outcomes, right, in that successful and unsuccessful recruitment before and after. So on the left and the right side of that center line, after implementing that difference in policy. And then focusing on the green line, we looked at outcomes from districts that had that standard 5-day school week and looked at the difference, the gap in lines that's shown between the red solid line and the red dotted line. And so that's essentially how the analysis worked. You can continue the slides, and Anita. And we also included control variables for teacher salary, student race, participation in free and reduced lunch, and the number of students enrolled in each district. And so what we found, I'm going to focus on statewide results first. So statewide, the districts considered in this analysis, of the districts considered in the analysis, about 14% of the districts had a 4-day school week schedule. And so what we saw was that statewide results did not show that the adoption of that 4-day school week had a significant effect on any measure of teacher recruitment, right? No measure of, or not on successful recruitment or on the 2 measures of unsuccessful recruitment. However, we did find as the percentage of white students enrolled increased, there was a very small increase, about 0.2%, in the number of vacancies filled by qualified applicants. You can continue to the next slide, Nita. Again, focusing on statewide results for this slide as well, we can see that our results showed that both 4- and 5-day school week districts were related to were positively related to recruitment. So as teacher salary increased, the number of altered courses decreased in both 4- and 5-day school weeks. And so while the effect size for that relationship is very small, it is consistent with Missouri educational administrators' perceptions that show that salary is a critical factor in recruiting qualified candidates. And so we included this graph on the right for you to see the differences in salary that Anita mentioned earlier. We can see that teacher salaries in the suburbs are highest at about $53,400. And in the rural districts, they're the lowest, right, with about $36,500. And then statewide, the salaries are about $40,000. Oh, and you can continue the next slide, Nita. So focusing now, right, those were results from statewide analyses. So right now we're going to focus on rural districts. So for the 2019-2020 school year, we saw that about 19% of rural districts adopted the 4-day school week. And when compared to districts with 5-day school weeks, we saw that successful recruitment for districts with the 4-day school week schedule was about 4% higher. And so remember, successful recruitment is being able to fill those vacancies with qualified applicants. And so in other words, when comparing our rural districts that adopted those 4-day school weeks to rural districts that had the 5-day school weeks, the 4-day school week had a positive effect on successfully filling positions with those qualified applicants. We also saw that teacher salary has a positive effect on teacher recruitment. So for each additional $1,000 in teacher salary, there was a 1% increase in successful recruitment. Next slide, please. And so this slide is also focusing on rural districts. And so here we can see that in rural 4-day school week and 5-day school week districts, with each additional $1,000 in teacher salary, there is a 1% decrease in unsuccessful recruitment in the form of hiring an unqualified teacher, right? So not only do we see that that teacher salary was positively associated with successful recruitment, but it was negatively associated with unsuccessful recruitment. And because those are measured 2 different ways, that's really important to make clear. Next slide, please. So overall, these results really provide some context for policymakers and administrators as they work to attract educators in Missouri, specifically in those rural areas, right? Our findings show that 4-day school weeks are a useful tool to help rural districts recruit qualified teachers. And it might be the case that districts that are struggling to recruit may want to consider implementing this, non-financial option that has been well received by teachers and parents. We can see that the effect of the 4-day school week schedule on teacher recruitment really is evident in these rural districts. but being very clear about the fact that these results don't hold when we're considering the districts statewide throughout Missouri. We saw in those rural to rural comparisons that both the 4-day school week and teacher salary were both associated with improving teacher recruitment. And so really our work here brings a more robust methodological approach to solve this real world policy issue for our Missouri K-12 districts. And so hopefully these findings are valuable to our Missouri policymakers and also to other states that Anita mentioned that are adopting these 4-day school week policies. And we are open to any questions or comments that y'all have.
Thanks very much, Anita and Sapna. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have just one quick point of follow-up, perhaps a bit of speculation on your part. Many of the problems the rural districts encounter, particularly in hiring and in their labor markets, are likely to persist even if they do adopt the 4-day school week. And given that, as you've outlined, a lot of districts have adopted in the past few years. Do you think that might kind of reach a point of saturation? And I guess my real question is, once districts have adopted this policy, they no longer have that kind of as a bargaining chip. They've already kind of exhausted that bargaining chip. So I guess, I'm asking you to speculate kind of where do you see this potentially going in the next few years, particularly as it might relate to retention, recruitment, things related to teacher labor markets?
I think that's a great question, Cameron, and it's something we've talked about. As of now, when we look at some of our like DD timing and our Bacon decomp and those sorts of analysis, we're not seeing differences between the early and late adopters. The effect is holding steady. But, certainly you would think there's going to reach a saturation point where this is no longer, outstanding or incentive. Maybe it becomes the norm, and perhaps the few rural districts that might be remaining with 5-day weeks, they're now disadvantaged. I don't know what that saturation point might be, but that's something to watch. And because there was a big influx in 4-day week school districts and then the subsequent school year after our analysis, I think that when we have those data and can take a better look at that, that's going to be a big signal too, because there was that huge jump from like 60 to 100 in 1 year. And so we're interested to analyze those data.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anita. And I think, Cameron, it's a good point. And I wonder if we're going to have to, obviously, I think teacher salary is going to come in more into play once that becomes more saturated. And I wonder what other factors we're going to need to add to our models once we hit that point.
I think another question is, right now, as of the point of our analysis, none of the city or suburban schools are participating in the 4-day week. So as some of those might start getting on board, that we'll see how that changes the factors as well.
Any other questions for Anita or Sapna?
I have one more quick one. Sorry to kind of hog the airtime here. I'm curious about your take on kind of state level intervention or state level regulation. I know that's a bit beyond the scope of what you studied. I recently saw a paper that there are pending regulations in Oklahoma, which might move the state in the opposite direction, where some 4-day weeks may have to revert to a 5-day week, depending on some accountability metrics. So perhaps, is there a role for the state to play here, or is this something probably best left to local districts?
From what I've seen, it's not uncommon for states to have sort of that rule that if your student learning outcomes go down and they put different parameters on that, then you might have to go back to a 5-day week and then have the option, if they go back up, to go back to a 4-day week. So I can see why the state would want to maybe have some oversight in that. as of now, the results as far as student outcomes are really mixed. And we do hope to study that a bit in Missouri. We all know the DESE data can be a little challenging to work with, but we hope to get a better understanding of that impact in Missouri. But I think you're right. I think that, as there's more awareness and more participation in 4-day school weeks, you're probably going to see more oversight and accountability at the state level.
Yeah, I agree with Anita. We are going to look at, I didn't have a chance to mention it at the end because I don't want us to go over, but we will be looking at student outcomes and then also at retention, and then adding those recent adopters, those 2021 adopters. And so I'm actually very interested to see the student outcomes in our sample, how that goes.
And another area that we also want to explore is really honing in on like the fields that have a lot more vacancies and turnover and trouble with recruitment, like the STEM area, special education, and hone in on those as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for those good questions, Cameron.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you, and Anita and Sapna. That was very informative and great presentation. I'll move us to our next speaker for the second session is Dr. Cameron Anglim. Cameron Anglim is an assistant professor of education policy and equity at the St. Louis University School of Education. Dr. Anglim's research and teaching are focused on the economics of education policy and education finance, work which is centered on the study of policy and program effects witnessed by disadvantaged students, their schools, and their governments. His session is titled Public Pre-K Access and Enrollment, Assessing Take-Up of Missouri's Early Childhood Education Funding Expansion. So I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Anglim.
Oops. Thanks. Just bear with me just one second as I get my computer running here. Okay. We are frozen. Bear with me just one second. Looks like I have a frozen computer. Evan, are you able to see my screen yet or no?
I am not.
Okay, let's see here. Just bear with me one second.
Yeah, I can see it.
There we go.
Yeah, it's there.
Is it full screen or just or the normal?
It's just
Normal.
the normal PowerPoint window.
Let's see here. My apologies here.
There you go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you very much for bearing with me. Sorry, it's only been over a year and a half of the pandemic and using Zoom. I'm still obviously
We'll get it eventually.
Obviously still learning. Thanks very much to everyone at PRiME, in particular to Evan and Ashley for running this really excellent summer program. It was my pleasure to get to work a little bit with some of the other folks and seeing their excellent presentations, both what we've just seen and what we will see in a few minutes. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about early childhood education funding in Missouri. And in particular, I'm going to zero in on a recent expansion to pre-K funding in Missouri. So my research over a long period of time has focused in particular on school funding and issues of equity within state school funding formulas. So this is kind of a foray into the pre-K space here in the state. So across the country, we see really wide gaps in terms of pre-K enrollment. So ECE opportunities, early childhood education opportunities in general, really vary significantly across the country. This map here is showing 4-year-olds who are served by state-run programs, though programs are administered really through a wide variety of different providers, be they federal, state, local, private. The pandemic has obviously shown a very bright light on certain deficits in our childcare provision, particularly for those of us who are low income across the country. Again, this map showing an excellent kind of resource from the National Institute for Early Education Research, the state of pre-K from 2020. Looking at Missouri in particular, Missouri only enrolls a pretty small fraction of its 3- and 4-year-old populations in publicly provided ECE programs. Obviously, there are a number of private programs in which many 3- and 4-year-olds likely are enrolled, but you see here kind of a few of those publicly provided programs. Head Start is likely one that may be familiar to some of you. Head Start is a federally funded and administered program here in Missouri and across the country, is a substantial portion of the public option that folks leverage here in the state. A large reason that states step in is to fill at least a part of this void in ECE provision in order to fund programs. So across the country, this funding really varies pretty significantly. Some states and localities offer universal pre-K to all their residents. Iowa, Illinois is starting a fairly new program, getting that up and running over the next few years. Other states offer means-tested programs. And what I mean by means-tested are those programs which qualify access depending on family income levels, the income of that student's family. Those income thresholds also vary, tend to vary by state. The map that I'm showing here shows the relative deficit that states have in terms of the gap between what they do fund and what would be deemed enough to fund pre-K at a high level, a robust program. So those in the darkest shade of red here, including Missouri, frankly, including the vast majority of the country, are those with the largest per pupil funding gaps, over $5,000 per year. So clearly ECE funding is one of the major roadblocks to achieving broader ECE access and enrollment across the country. Again, those gaps persist in Missouri, but they likewise persist really across the country. So what is Missouri's early childhood education landscape? So I'm going to talk a little bit, and this is particularly related to funding. I'll talk for the rest of the time, I'm going to focus primarily on House Bill 1689, which was passed in 2014. I'll talk in greater detail just in a minute. But momentum in the state is really bubbling up over the past few years. The pandemic has obviously interrupted that momentum, which I'll talk about in a second. But the time is really ripe right now in Missouri for this conversation, spurred in no small part by 2 significant federal grants in 2019, the larger of which was a large preschool development grant, Birth to 5, extension of prior federal funding. On the local level, funding has been a little bit mixed in recent years. So if you live here in St. Louis City, we passed a recent sales tax ballot initiative in the last election to expand funding. A similar initiative was pulled from the ballot in the county. And in Kansas City, voters rejected a much more substantial increase only a few years ago. You likely saw, or hopefully saw in the news only over the past few weeks and months, that the state is trying to coalesce its oversight over ECE programs through the creation of the Office of Childhood within DESE. That's an office that frankly really excites me. I'm really looking forward to seeing the work that they will be able to do on behalf of pre-K and other early childhood care and education opportunities across the state. And it's frankly nice to see the state focused on this area, which clearly is of great importance. Finally, and I leave this for the last because it was not passed, House Bill 973 was introduced, which I'll talk about in a minute, in the last legislative session, but might potentially be a preview of what is to come at the state level in terms of increased investment, increased funding in state pre-K, state-funded pre-K opportunities. So what is House Bill 1689? Why is it important? Why am I focused on it? The House Bill 1689 was passed in 2014, came into effect for the vast majority of districts in 2018 or 19, in order for the state to intervene to provide funding for full day pre-K. So those districts and charter school programs are eligible to receive state funding, which operates through the state's foundation formula. That's the formula that the state uses to parcel out state funding to schools, largely based on the types of students those schools serve. So low-income students, English language learner students, students with disabilities, et cetera. House Bill 1689 differs slightly in that funding is only eligible for free or reduced price lunch eligible students, so FRPL eligible students, up to a threshold of 4% of the total number of FRPL eligible students in that district between the ages of 3 and 18. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but the takeaway here is this funding is available for low-income students at public school districts and public charter schools in the state. So House Bill 973, remember I just mentioned, was not passed, but House Bill 973, which may be reintroduced in future legislative sessions, essentially seeks to expand what House Bill 1689 has offered. So instead of 4%, it proposes an expansion to 6, 8, 10% of eligible FRPL students. Though again, this has not passed. It'll be interesting to see in the next legislative session, early 2022, and in future years, if this bill gains momentum. So what am I going to be doing to analyze House Bill 1689? First, the current research. Though this funding is available to public school districts and to charter schools, not all of those districts and charter schools are taking up that funding. Some funding is being left on the table, so to speak. So my questions largely are two in this current work. Are districts and charter schools using their available funding? Quite simply, are they using what's being made available to them by the state? And then the second kind of related question, what explains or helps predict that variation in funding take-up? Are there characteristics, be they enrollment size, school geography? We just saw a great presentation looking in particular at rural districts in the state. Are rural districts something about rural or urban geography, student characteristics, et cetera? Are there characteristics of these districts, of their students, that are correlated or relate to district funding take-up? Got a long list of future research items, which I won't speak much to today, but which I think are still really critical questions for this program. The first being, does expanded state funding through 1689 or other mechanisms actually expand pre-K enrollment, or might it conversely drive substitution away from other providers? So remember, I mentioned that pre-K is offered through a number of different public, private providers. So it's possible that extra funding expands the pot, expands the pie of pre-K enrollment here in the state, or it's also possible that it might just divert enrollment from one provider to another provider, or somewhere in between. Okay. Similarly, on the funding side, do districts and charter schools use this funding to expand their total funding, or does this result in perhaps a substitution away from other funding streams? In the economics literature, this is basically the flypaper and crowd out effect. Which one takes hold? Okay, it's possible that additional state funding might translate into lower local funding, which is not what we would want to see if we're looking to see expanded pre-K funding. So that's really an empirical question, which I'll seek to address in future work. Third, what do districts do with this funding? Do they use it to expand their hiring, expand their early childhood staffs, be they teachers, other support staff members? And does additional state funding exert spillover effects or externalities or perhaps unintended consequences on non-LEA, LEA being districts and charters, non-LEA run ECE providers? So if we give more state funding for public pre-K in the state through school districts and charters, does that reduce Head Start enrollment? Does that reduce private enrollment? In some other state settings, including New York City, which has universal pre-K access, the expansion of pre-K through public providers has actually harmed other types of providers, private providers in particular. It's not clear if that's a good or a bad thing. That would largely depend on pre-K quality, but there is the potential for state funding to exert externalities or spillover effects on other types of providers. But again, I'm going to focus on these first two questions. Do districts use their available funding, and what explains a variation in that use? What types of district characteristics? The elephant in the room in this conversation, and perhaps almost every one of our conversations these days, is the pandemic. Over the past year and a half, pre-K enrollment has declined really precipitously across the state. K-12 to a lesser extent has declined as well. And though this work is certainly not agnostic to COVID-related factors, the goal of this project is not to focus on COVID-related enrollment decline, but rather to use pre-COVID data, pre-COVID findings to inform, fingers crossed, post-COVID pre-K enrollment. So I'm not going to be delving into the specifics of COVID-related childcare issues. It would be, the short answer is, it would be very difficult to disentangle the effects of this policy, House Bill 1689, from other COVID-related impacts on childcare centers, on early childhood education, on in-person versus virtual learning, which is particularly difficult or impossible for very young children. So I'm going to focus exclusively on the 2019-20 school year. So I know the pandemic started during the 19-20 school year, but I'm going to focus on this school year. Enrollment counts, at least, were certified in the state prior to the onset of the pandemic in March of 2020. Okay. So just a bit on enrollment expansion over the past few years in the state. As you can see on the left there, LEA pre-K enrollment has expanded pretty well over the past 5 years, 2015 to 2020. That second column there, YOY's year over year LEA pre-K enrollment growth, 4%, 4.4%, 3.5%, one little blip of almost flat growth. And then obviously we see this big cliff in 2021 using some preliminary data that DESE has made available. But again, I'm going to focus on that 19-20 year. And do notice, however, that growth, even though it's fairly modest in terms of the count of students, between a few hundred and up to about 1,500 per year, it far outstrips what the state is witnessing at the K-12 level. K-12, the state has been declining, even if just modestly, but declining in enrollment over the medium term. So regardless of the idiosyncratic pandemic year, from 2015 to 2020, we saw very incremental K-12 enrollment decline. So on the one hand, pre-K enrollment is increasing. On the other hand, K-12 slightly decreasing. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the future of both of these types of enrollment, both pre-K and K-12 enrollment in the years to come. In this figure, I map House Bill 1689 funding take-up, again, looking at the 2019 and 1920 school year. Those districts which are shaded most darkly, so that SLU blue color there, the dark blue, those are districts that are using every dime, every nickel that they have available to them through the state. So St. Louis Public Schools would be one of those types of districts. And then as you go lighter in shading, the lighter shaded districts, or the lightest shaded districts, excuse me, are those which have not claimed any funding from the state. So you'll see the majority of states across the country have not claimed any funding, at least as of the 1920 year. Many states are in between, claiming some share of the funding made available to them, and a subset of the state's districts have claimed every dollar that is available to them. I also include the two areas in the state where charter schools currently operate, St. Louis City and Kansas City, which are kind of in the middle. They've claimed some share of funding, but not everything that is available to them. Okay. As you can see here, eyeballing the state's geography, rural regions in particular have demonstrated kind of low funding take-up, although, you'll note some kind of key exceptions to that. There are rural regions in the state where funding take-up has been high, even higher on a proportional basis than some suburban areas, though there's kind of great variation in the state's rural districts. Something like 2/3 or more of the state's districts are located in rural areas, so rural funding take-up in Missouri is a particularly important thing to take note of. So unlike Anita and Sapna, I'm not going to offer kind of a really nice visual as to the regression analyses. And excuse me, I'm just going to rewind just a little bit. But I'm going to talk through the findings of my regression analyses, which help explain kind of what factors predict funding take-up or are associated with funding take-up. And I'll go one by one. First, the more low-income students an LEA serves, remember an LEA just a public school district or a charter school, the more likely that LEA is to use its available funding. This is a fairly intuitive finding, right? This funding in particular was targeted towards low-income students. Low-income students are those who are eligible. So those districts that serve larger shares of those types of students have been more likely to use more or all of the funding that has been made available to them by the state. Second finding is a bit counterintuitive. So charter schools have been less likely in a regression finding to have received and access House Bill 1689 funding. And the reason I say it's counterintuitive is because actually a greater share of charter schools have received funding relative to traditional public school districts. But what the regression analyses show is that is likely attributable to other factors beyond kind of the charter or non-charter status. So things like their student makeup, their funding, their geography. Remember, charter schools in the state currently are only located in urban areas, in Kansas City and in St. Louis City, such that their charter status is parallel or synonymous with geography. Their geography doesn't vary. So charter schools have been slightly less likely to have received House Bill 1689 funding, holding everything else about them constant. Okay. Rural school districts have been over 20% less likely to receive state funding for pre-K. That's 20% less likely relative to suburban districts, and even less likely relative to those urban LEAs. And we saw that just a slide ago in the map of the state. LEAs with higher student-teacher ratios have been more likely to receive this funding, okay? Why might that be the case? Well, these are districts and charter schools with fewer teachers relative to the amount of students they serve. So they might be seeking out this funding in particular to make and drive hiring possibilities, okay, to reduce their student-teacher ratios, be that with more teachers, be that with more support staff, be that to improve facilities, et cetera. So LEAs with higher student-teacher ratios more likely to have pursued and received this funding stream from the state. Finally, school expenditures and revenues, in other words, how much a school or district spends on a per pupil basis, doesn't really help predict the likelihood of funding take-up. So it's not as if all other things equal, high spending or low spending districts are the ones driving these findings. Expenditure patterns, revenue patterns are not really helpful in predicting likelihood of funding take-up. So we've got both high funded districts that have adopted, taken on this funding, funded districts that have not. Conversely, low funded districts that have pursued this funding, low funded districts that also have not pursued this funding. So prevailing school expenditures and revenues don't significantly kind of explain what's going on here, okay? So three really key takeaways in my mind. Increased funding, particularly through House Bill 1689 and possibly through other mechanisms through the state legislature, really offer tremendous promise to expand critical ECE and pre-K offerings for low-income students in Missouri. This is a really good step that the state is making, in my opinion, and I'm hopeful for even greater expansion in the years to come. However, we've seen variation in what districts and charter schools have used this funding. Okay, so for example, rural school districts have demonstrated lower rates of take-up. Again, there's variation across those rural districts, but lower on average take-up than their counterparts in other geographies. Although there is much funding take-up to be made, gains to be made in suburban districts as well. So kind of the short of that story is there is still, excuse me, there is still money being left on the table, so to speak. Okay, so there is money that the state, that districts could be utilizing from the state that currently is not being utilized. So the big question is why? Why has funding take-up varied? So currently, literally just conducting our first interviews with a doctoral student of mine, Paula Langley. We are partnering on a study to kind of understand why this funding take-up has varied. Okay, so might it be that districts don't have enough staff to accommodate more pre-K students? Might it be that districts and charter schools lack the facilities space to expand their pre-K offerings? Might it be other reasons? Might it be that rural districts don't have the critical mass of students in order to hire a new teacher to pursue pre-K? Remember, there are rural districts that have very low enrollments, 200 students or fewer in the entire district. So if 1, 2, 3 students might be able to receive funding, that might not be enough to make a new hire in order to start a pre-K program. These are hypotheses that we have as we're interviewing district leaders and charter school leaders across the state in the weeks and months to come. Thanks very much. I would really appreciate any comments and questions that you might have. If not today, please don't hesitate to email me at my email address there on the screen. And just one last thanks to the folks at PRiME, to Evan, to Ashley, and to the other excellent presenters. It's really been my pleasure, and I hope to engage with you all in the future. I appreciate it.
Any questions for Cameron?
I have one. That was great, Cameron. I love how you set those results up. I wonder, so this is me just like thinking about it from a public administration standpoint. I wonder, in your interviews, are you also asking questions about leadership attributes of the leaders in general of those entities?
Yeah, so we're doing a bit of that. We've got a few additional hypotheses that I didn't mention just now that I think might possibly kind of relate to some of the to what you're kind of hinting at. There is some indication that districts and charter schools that are more collaborative, so those that partner with other local area providers, those that kind of get out of their own district boundaries, have been more successful in kind of generating economies of scale, so to speak. So in partnering with other local providers in order to pool their resources. So the Kansas City Pre-K Cooperative, kind of anecdotally, has been really well regarded in that respect. The St. Louis Pre-K Cooperative has been a bit of a more recent emergence relative to Kansas City. There's been some speculation that program could help drive kind of regional collaboration. So it'll be interesting to kind of delve into those elements on the qualitative level.
Yeah.
Sapna, are there any other particular kind of leadership qualities that you might hypothesize?
No, I was really just thinking about collaboration and partnership, and then, you know, not only those formal partnerships, right, but also like in our field, we, you know, look at those informal like connections, right? Maybe they're just like friends and share ideas, and then have like, you know, figured out how to make some things work on the side, and not necessarily like engage in this full like contractual connection to each other.
Yeah, you know, that's why, you know, just being frank, I'm a quantitative researcher by training, but this, it kind of almost, you know, hit me in the face. This project really lends itself to a mixed methods approach to try to uncover some of the types of things that you're suggesting.
Yeah, I love it. No, I'm mixed method, so that's definitely why.
There's lots to learn from the numbers here, but I will readily admit that they don't tell the entire picture. So from the start, this was kind of a mixed methods focused project. We focus on the quant now as we kind of ran through the rationale as to what types of questions and kind of what narrative we were looking to uncover on the qualitative side. But really looking forward to getting engaged in that work in the months to come.
Yeah, I love it. This looks great. Good work.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for Cameron?
Yeah, I had a quick question. So first, thanks, Cameron. You know, this is really a great study, and I'm excited to see, you know, where you take this, especially when you add in some of the interviews. You know, part of me is just wondering, like, how much of what you're seeing, like, might be a product of how schools are responding to the wants of parents, and so that's just one thing that occurred to me. I'm not sure like how much that may be or may not be in your qualitative component, but I am wondering, like, are schools, you know, how intentionally they're responding to parents who may either, you know, be wanting more of these seats or may be seeking other options, you know,
yeah, you know, I think that's a really good question, Jason. Thanks for your question. In our sampling of districts and charter schools, we are pursuing a purposive sampling technique where we are sampling districts and charter schools across multiple dimensions. So one of the dimensions is a pre-existing funding take-up, high take-up, low take-up, or no take-up, in order to make sure we've got good coverage on that element of variation. We are sampling across different types of districts and charter schools of varying enrollment. So big districts, relatively low enrolled districts. We're sampling across school geography, so urban, suburban, rural, regions in the state. So, you know, Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, Southwest. Because one of the reasons we wanted to do that was because of your question. Is there, you know, a robust regional, perhaps, variation in parental demand? Perhaps in rural areas, is there lower demand? Perhaps in urban areas, is there higher demand? And is that being driven by kind of the types of options parents have access to, the types of options parents might prefer? I kind of leave that as an open question. I don't have a kind of solid a priori sense of why and how parental preferences might vary across these contexts, but we wanted to do our best to cover our bases. So we're not interviewing, 500 different, school districts and charter schools across the state, but in constructing that sample, that subset, we wanted to try to capture as much variation as possible, because I do think it's likely that the answer to your question is yes. I just don't have a good sense of how those preferences, how and why those preferences might vary.
Cameron, I also really enjoyed your presentation, and I think this is so interesting. And having looked at rural school districts all summer, as you mentioned, that was one of my thoughts, that some of the districts are so small that they may not have the infrastructure or the students to have the demand for this. Something else I was wondering about is labor force participation rates in the different areas. So, if maybe there tends to be stay-at-home grandparents or parents or other folks, that maybe that could be one of those things that affects parental demand as well. And then, of course, I'm always thinking about what's happening in politics right now, and we'll see what happens with this larger reconciliation infrastructure bill. But of course, there's funding slated in there for universal pre-K. So that would be interesting to see how that might just totally upend all of this as well. So just a few thoughts I thought I would share.
Yeah, no, I am likewise kind of keeping my ear to, I was going to say to the ground, but to my computer on the infrastructure and the pre-K funding. It's been kind of waxing and waning in the past few months. So I'm really excited to see where that might go. I think your 4-day school week research and my ECE research, one of the things they have in common potentially is one of the elements that you described. Potential parental labor participation might in some ways relate to parental preferences for having a 5th day either in school or out of school, or having kind of robust ECE offerings, grandparent participation, maternal mothers, or maternal labor participation. I do think likely has some type of role here. So it'll be interesting from the kind of school leader perspective to try to uncover kind of how they interpret those parental preferences, and the extent to which we uncover whether those preferences kind of drive districts' likelihood to pursue this funding. Because it's my guess that those certainly do play a role, particularly in those rural areas. It's just a little bit difficult to uncover that quantitatively, at least as it pertains to the preferences. So I think the qualitative work will be really helpful in that respect.
Great. Thanks everybody for the questions. And like Cameron said, please feel free to reach out to him with any additional questions and comments. So we're going to move to our last speakers for today. This is a collaborative effort across both SLU and WashU. The first author is Dan Ferris, who is the Assistant Dean for Policy Initiatives and an Assistant Professor of Practice at the Brown School, where he brings experience in a range of academic, community, and policy settings into his teaching, research, and practice. He leads the Data Science for Social Impact Initiative at the Social Policy Institute at WashU and contributes across a range of different policy training and research areas with a particular interest in food insecurity, which we'll hear more about today. He is also currently pursuing his PhD in public and social policy at St. Louis University. One of Dan's co-authors, Ness Sandoval, is professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at St. Louis University, where he is also the co-director of the Public and Social Policy PhD program. His research expertise and primary interests are in demography, spatial statistics, sociology, and immigration. Dr. Sandoval also serves as Associate Director for GeoSLU, a regional hub of multidisciplinary geospatial science based at St. Louis University. Third author is Jason Jabari, a former middle school teacher who currently leads the education research portfolio at the Social Policy Institute, where he applies advanced statistical techniques to analyze large-scale surveys and other sources of complex data. Dr. Jabari partners with a variety of community organizations to help them understand and solve pressing problems in education. And fourth author is Young Chun, currently leading the housing research portfolio at the Social Policy Institute. As a quantitative data analyst based primarily on econometric approaches, he focuses on housing and education policy for socioeconomically marginalized families in the United States. His recent research has been disseminated through various channels, including the Brookings Institution, ABC6, and many others. Their session is titled Putting Policy to Practice, School Meal Innovation to Improve Student Outcomes. So without further ado, welcoming our last presenters for today.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Evan. Thanks to SLU PRiME, Evan Ashley, and of course the other summer research awardees who offered terrific feedback and suggestions over the past few months. Also a very special shout out to the students in social policy analysis and evaluation who have kindly given up the first half hour of class tonight to join us here for this presentation and this discussion. So welcome all, we're really looking forward to it. So through the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program, schools have become a significant source of meals and nutrition for young people and for children. This matters as research shows school meal participation impacts student outcomes and food security, academic and behavioral outcomes, and health. Schools have at their disposal a number of different program and policy mechanisms, including the community eligibility provision and breakfast after the bell, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, at their disposal to increase participation. Why this matters for Missouri? Well, in Missouri, most recent data shows that 11.5% of all households are food insecure, including over 200,000 children. Missouri ranks relatively high in terms of breakfast participation in comparison to lunch, which is a really common way that advocates in food policy show effectiveness in terms of providing breakfast. However, more than half of potential free and reduced price breakfasts are still not served or received by eligible students. And the scope and scale of free and reduced price free and reduced price meal programs is extensive. Less than 1% of schools in Missouri reported having no free or reduced price meal eligible students. So for our project, we wanted to take a close look at breakfast after the bell and the community eligibility provision. So how do schools increase participation in meals when they lead to better outcomes, especially breakfast, which has historically lagged behind lunch. So breakfast after the bell programs like breakfast in the classroom, second chance, grab and go, improve access compared to traditional cafeteria models of breakfast service. Like Jason, having spent some time also working in a school, I've seen this firsthand, some of the barriers and opportunities for increasing students' ability to receive healthy, nutritious food at school. These programs are typically implemented at the school level. And then, as we see in Missouri, more than 1,000 Missouri schools use at least one of these approaches, one of these breakfast after the bell approaches in terms of attempting to increase student participation in school meals. And the community eligibility provision is also done at the school level, and where schools can utilize CEP to increase free meal eligibility and reimbursement rates. So a little bit of background, the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act passed in 2010, and this federal legislation allows schools with higher percentages of free and reduced priced eligible students to provide universal free school meals, which reduces administrative burden, stigma, and increases free meal access. In Missouri, we see and find that 57.7% of eligible schools utilize CEP. And in terms of the overall total, this is just less than 1 in 5 Missouri schools in total are utilizing CEP. So for our project, we had a couple of key questions that guided our summer. And so we were interested to understand more about the schools that are adopting CEP and breakfast after the bell, whether these programs increase meal participation, and then whether there are observable associated changes in a range of student outcomes. We matched schools with similar characteristics in program adoption to estimate how many additional free and reduced price breakfasts can be attributed to breakfast after the bell in particular. So the data that we had to work from, so we have school level data obtained from the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, or DESE, for the years 2016 to 2020. We have school characteristics, so school level, school type, school size, and school region, things that we were able to account for in our analysis. In the school meal front, of course, whether or not schools were eligible for and participating in the community eligibility provision, CEP, what and when they were adopting in terms of breakfast after the bell. And then, of course, free and reduced priced meal participation. And so we calculated this by taking the average number of free and reduced price meals that were served at a school and dividing that by the average free and reduced price eligible students times the average number of breakfast days that schools reported to DESE. And then, of course, we have education outcome data as well, which we'll talk about just a little bit later on. To walk us through the results, I'm pleased to pass it over to my colleague and co-researcher, Jung.
Yeah, so through a series of the descriptive and explanatory analysis using both econometric and spatial techniques, we found several notable aspects regarding free and reduced price school meal program participation and provisions. First, both community eligibility provision and breakfast after the bell program participation have significantly increased during the study period. So between 2016 to 2020, CEP participation has increased by 7 percentage points, and BATB participation has increased by 10%. The proportion of schools participating in both programs has been increased by 14 percentage points. Second, we also found that the participation of the two programs are somewhat related to each other. So school participating in CEP is almost twice more likely to participate in at least one BATB programs. Last, but most importantly, we found that such a program participation have actually directed to the free and reduced price breakfast provision to eligible students. So our econometric models indicate that the BATB participation increases the free and BAT participation increase the free and reduced price breakfast servings to eligible students by 1.5 percentage point. While the 1.5 percentage point increase seems very teeny tiny, but actually it is very huge, which is a total of 810,000 more breakfasts served per year. Next, please. A series of a map on the left and the bar chart on the right represent the change in CEP eligibility and participation in Missouri over time. As we can see on the right bar charts, the rate of the CEP participation to eligible schools has gradually increased over the study period from 42% to 60%. What is also interesting is its geographic distribution. At the early stage of the program, most of the CEP participating schools were clustered in the two metropolitan areas in Missouri, which are St. Louis and Kansas City. However, as time went by, the CEP participation dispersed to other areas, and now we can see some other clusters in St. Joseph on the northwest, Columbia in the central Missouri, and some rural area in southeast corner of the state. Next, please. The next slide examines the CEP participation in St. Louis City and County. Again, the CEP participation to eligible schools has gradually increased from 77% in 2015 to 94% in 2019. In the early years, the CEP participation has highly concentrated in the St. Louis City boundary, while many schools in Northern County were eligible not less participating in the program. However, as time went by, many schools outside of the city boundary, especially many in the Northern County, where are has been known as a marginalized, starting to participate in the program. So now Dr. Jabari would elaborate our findings in detail.
Yeah, thanks, Yun. So I'm going to take us through a couple other results and what they look like over time. And so here we have, on the left, we have the percent of free and reduced price meals served. That's a proportion. And we have schools over the course of years. And so we have, if we look closely, I think at two of the lines on the very left. So the brown line, That is schools that don't participate in CEP or breakfast after the bell. And we can see that has, over the course of 4 years, the lowest rates of free reduced price breakfast participation. Conversely, if we look at the yellow line, which participates in both CEP and one of the breakfast after the bell programs, we see it actually has the highest growth in terms of the percent of free reduced price meals served. On the right, we have another graph here. And again, we see that both for CEP and non-CEP schools participating in breakfast after the bell programs significantly increases the percent of free reduced price meals served. We can go to the next slide. Great. And so last, I'd like to talk a little bit about education outcomes. So I think for the folks that are working in schools right now, you're wondering, like, what effect will this have on classrooms? And we're very interested in that as well. And so we know that there is a positive association between, eating school meals and attendance, achievement, performance, behavior. And so there's been some early research by some of our colleagues that have found that breakfast after the bell and similar programs have had a marked increase in achievement. And so here in our preliminary analysis, we looked at proficiency exams in English language arts and math in Missouri. And again, we compared schools that were similar across a number of different aspects. They only differed in their participation in one of the breakfast after the bell programs. We found two things, and I think this matches what we would expect to find. We found that for schools that participated in one of the breakfast after the bell programs, the proportion of students scoring below basic or basic on math tests decreased. At the same time, the proportion of students scoring proficient or advanced increased. So we were able in our early results to kind of demonstrate this, which matches some of our prior assumptions. And I think one thing we're excited about is taking this particular part and doing some more expansive analysis, thinking about other academic outcomes to include, and kind of reworking and refining some of our mechanisms for identifying the impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sandoval.
Great, thank you. So we would like to leave you with just a few remarks about the overall findings and ways that we think about this project, and we can think about possible innovations with our research design. I think overall, the research suggests that access matters, and that that's probably one of the top line findings. And if we look specifically at why access matters, we could point to the ease of administrative burdens in trying to deliver meal service for these children. And second is flexibility and innovation. And so I think that's one of the important takeaway points that we'd like to leave you with. I think the second point is we have to recognize that we are in a pandemic, and so a lot of schools now have school meal options, but we also recognize that food insecurity has increased, and so what we're finding is pre-COVID, and so we have to recognize that there's going to be what we're studying now, and then there'll be hopefully a post-COVID analysis of what's happening. One thing that I can just bring from my personal experience is when we think about this, it's about not only having access to food, but having access to healthy food. And so I'm familiar with one of the school districts. And so, yes, the children do have access to food, but if they want access to healthy food, they actually have to pay for it. And so this raises a question for me about, yes, it's free, but should we be providing free and access food? And so that's just an anecdote from my personal experience. And then finally, there's a tremendous opportunity from this research project is to look at innovative research designs that allow us to leverage the geospatial data that's part of this data set. And so we were able to look at what we call geospatial intelligence that provides timely and actionable and accurate information for policymakers and school officials. And so if you go back and look at the maps that the Young provide, we have prima facie evidence that we probably should be engaging in spatial autoregressive or conditional autoregressive models to provide more accurate information. And so with that, we go to our next slide and we'll answer questions. Great, thank you. So we're open for questions.
I know that y'all didn't necessarily talk about this in depth, but I'd be curious to see like which program itself was most beneficial. I worked in, my internship was in a school that worked with breakfast, second chance breakfast. And so, and I just always wondered about like breakfast in the class, what that would do with like community and have like in social emotional learning and those types of things as well. So I'd just be curious to see which option's the best.
It's a great question. And if I had set up a poll in advance, I'd love to poll the audience. Say, what do you think? Which of the 3 breakfast after the bell programs, like logically, would increase participation the most, right? And so we have 3 options. We've got breakfast after the bell, option 1, breakfast in the classroom. And typically schools that are adopting breakfast in the classroom provide universal free meals. And so, like as we were saying, schools that are, there's a connection between CEP and increased universal free meals and the ability to provide breakfast in the classroom for free for all students is an administrative and access issue. And then, second chance and grab and go, also as good options, for in terms of meeting students where they are, particularly students who aren't able to be there for a traditional cafeteria served breakfast. But as we would see and as we would imagine, breakfast in the classroom for the schools that are able to implement it with universal free meals, with utilizing a mechanism like CEP, are going to increase their participation significantly. When we look at levels, elementary schools tend to have the highest breakfast participation as well. And so I think that's reflective both of the mechanisms that they're using, as well as the age of the students and the levels of who they're serving. Great question. Other questions that folks have?
I really enjoyed your presentation, and this might be outside the scope of what you were studying, but maybe you can speculate for me. As we saw that big increase from just concentration in Kansas City and St. Louis to a lot of participation in rural areas, I'm wondering if you have an idea of what drove that increase and how we might continue that spread. Are there administrative features that need to be in place, or just information or public opinion? I mean, I know recently a lot of attention was brought to sort of universal school food programs through the Wisconsin district that didn't want to spoil their students with food. So is it, attitudes or administrative support, or do you have an idea about that?
Fantastic question. So I'll take a crack, and then I'll turn to my colleagues as well if folks have other thoughts about this in particular, or policy diffusion and implementation kind of more broadly, because I think there's some really interesting ways to speculate here. On the first side, I'm so glad you brought up the school district in Wisconsin also, which was, came to national attention for folks who aren't familiar, for refusing the waiver to allow and provide federally subsidized free meals during the pandemic. And so coming from New York, which was actually really early in the universal school breakfast movement, 10, 15 years ago, there was actually significant pushback from the Speaker of the City Council at the time and the then mayor around speculation that actually providing everyone with free breakfast would increase obesity. And so they should not be promoting free meals for all. So these have been debunked and these have been pushed back. But in terms of to your question, Anita, which I think is a really good one, how we saw policy kind of spreading both in terms of St. Louis, kind of a core of St. Louis City, and then seeing over time it's spreading to the larger metropolitan region. And then, as I've called it, to Jung's phenomenal animated maps, cheers to Jung. I can't stop staring at them. I might bring them back up so folks can just observe and enjoy a little bit more. Watching and kind of seeing the policy change and the adoption over time is really fascinating. And so, that clusters, I think, were happening incrementally, I think is notable. So it wouldn't just typically be, a single school kind of acting on its own. It would happen in a group. And then also, thinking over time about what that looks like, why it wasn't all at first. And, I think there were some early adopters that typically had stood to benefit the most from the program in terms of having higher percentages of students who would be eligible in the reimbursement mechanisms, as well as just thinking about in terms of the rollout. I know there are a number of advocacy organizations and education and school meal focused groups who've done tremendous work promoting and advocating for not only CEP adoption, but implementation of breakfast after the bell. Our good friends and colleagues at Operation Food Search and No Kid Hungry, nationally, FRAC, the Food Research Action Committee. These things just weren't happening organically. I think there was a lot of work happening at the grassroots level and at the advocacy level to work with and support schools through some of the challenges that they would have with any kind of policy administrative implementation burdens. I don't know if Ness, Jung, Jason, anything you wanted to add in terms of policy diffusion or thinking?
There may be opportunities when we think about a geospatial framework to look at what we would call spatial regimes and trying to see if we can identify these spatial regimes and then correlate it with other types of social economic characteristics that are emerging. And so I think this is what's exciting about the project, because not only does it have a policy implication, but it has these methodological innovations that can be made with this data set. And so that's what's exciting about it.
Thanks, Anita.
We did have a question in the chat asking if there were any significant differences between uptake and outcomes by school type, such as elementary, middle, and high school.
Uptake and let me just see that. Uptake and outcomes. So in terms of the preliminary analysis, I can take a quick look and just highlight a couple of things from some of what we've looked at, just kind of like on a year-by-year snapshot level. If you're referencing in terms of some of the educational outcomes, I'd have to look to Jason in terms of thinking about if there are any kind of differences by school level or school type from the education outcome standpoint when we were looking at proficiency, like subject matter proficiency.
Yeah, so we actually use all the observational data as ways to balance schools on breakfast after the bell. So things like the level of school, whether it's elementary, middle, or high, like we use those to balance the samples in order to really isolate the policy mechanism of breakfast after the bell. But I do think as we kind of take this further, definitely looking to see like is there some differences, are there some heterogeneous treatment effects would be really valuable. So that's something that we look forward to in terms of that regard.
Yeah, and in addition to Jay's comments, so we also think about the heterogeneous the effects of the program on the education outcome by geography. So for example, so the low income neighborhoods are more effective. So the program is more effective in the lower income neighborhood, whereas it's less effective in the mixed income neighborhood. So our the next plan would be to run some the geographically weighted regression model to explore the heterogeneous spatial effects of the program on the outcomes or the other things. So yeah, this is very good question. Thank you.
In terms of just the CEP utilization and breakfast after the bell, I put in the chat just a quick snapshot for one of the most recent years we have data for in terms of how the breakfast to lunch ratio differs by school level. But when we look at CEP utilization, we mentioned roughly 1 in 5 schools that are eligible or participating. And so it's slightly higher for elementary schools, middle and high schools, slightly lower, around 15%. And then for breakfast after the bell, we don't see as significant of differences as you might see across all of the breakfast after the bell models when you look at all of them together. So schools that are doing 1 or more, the most is actually middle schools, and just slightly over 50%. And then just closely followed by high school or elementary. To the great earlier question in terms of which of them are the most impactful and what schools are reporting, you'd think about high school or middle school being more likely to do something like second chance availability or grab and go, where elementary might have less saturation of breakfast after the bell overall, but when they are doing it, they're more likely to do something like breakfast in the classroom. Any last questions?
Well, thanks everybody for joining us for today's webinar. I want to extend a big thank you to all of our researchers for their hard work and dedication to the projects over the summer and for their time presenting this evening. Policy briefs associated with each of these presentations will be available on the PRiME Center's website that I'm going to drop in the chat real quick. Please go and take a look. We'll also post the videos associated with the presentations. If you go to our website, you can stay informed of all of our publications, future webinars, and engage with the PRiME Center. So please sign up for our newsletter at sluprime.org. Follow us on Twitter at slu_prime. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their Tuesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.